Hello everyone and welcome to the final round of the FTX Crypto Cup. It is Magnus Carlsen versus Praggnanandhaa, and it is, well, this is the match that wins it all. If Prag wins, he needs to win in the Rapids to win 3 points, and then he wins the entire event. And Magnus, as he's already leading the event, he needs also to beat Prag to win the event. These are the standings after the previous round. So Magnus leading with 15 points and Prag in the lead, or rather trailing with 13 points. So Prag needs to win in the Rapids to win the whole thing, and I will be returning, or rather I will be reinstating the timestamps. I know that this is a pretty weird thing to say, as those of you who don't use the timestamps have no actual use of this information, and those of you who use the timestamps to jump straight into the game will never even know I've said this. But there you have it, I've said it. So let's dive straight into it, as well, game 1 is already quite an impressive one. So Magnus with the white pieces opens with the reti. We have knight to f3 and Prag goes for d5. We have pawn to g3, going for the King's Indian attack. Pawn to c5, Prag grabs the full center, and the bishop to g2, sort of the Sicilian variation of the King's Indian attack. Knight to c6, we have d4 by Magnus, and e6 now. Castles and c captures on d4, the so-called reverse Grunfeld variation. Knight captures on d4 and bishop to c5. Now putting pressure on the knight, it's being attacked by the bishop and by the knight. So knight captures, b captures, and now pawn to c4, attacking that wonderful center. Knight to f6 by Prag, and now queen to c2 by Magnus. We have queen to e7, and here Magnus shows that he's been doing his homework. He did quite a lot of research, and he found a game Prag already played this year in the Norway Chess Open against Chatalbashev that ended in a draw, where bishop to g5 was played. But Magnus improves in this game. He plays knight to c3, and it is now not already as of move 10, but after castles and bishop to f4. Is that we have a completely new game already as of move 11. So Prag goes bishop to a6. It is aimed directly at stopping white from executing b4, because white wants to play a3, b4, but for the moment the c4 pawn is being threatened. So here knight to a4. Magnus defends it with a tactic, because if you go for bishop captures on c4 now, it seems like it's really great and everything, but then comes knight captures on c5, queen captures, and now the spectacular b3 wins the bishop. If the bishop moves, of course, the queen hangs. So Prag not about to fall for this. He just plays bishop to b4, and now pawn to a3, gaining a tempo on the bishop, bishop back to d6, and now you still can't push b4 as c4 is being threatened. So here Magnus plays bishop captures, queen captures, and rook f to d1. Now he is threatening b4. Prag will not be able to capture here because, well, if bishop captures, queen can just capture, and the rook picks up the queen. So it's a free bishop basically. So queen to e7, Prag retreats with the queen, and now Magnus has to settle for b3, and this is already a small victory in itself for Praggnanandhaa, denying Magnus that beautiful b4 square. So rook 8 to b8, continuing the fight for the b4 square, and queen to c3 now. Magnus says, all right, you've done very nicely, but I am going to play queen to a5 and put pressure on your queen side, as it's looking a bit weak. So here d captures on c4, b captures on c4. Now Magnus doesn't even have a b pawn to play pawn to b4, and now pawn to c5 by Prag. Rook to d3, Magnus is ready to double up rooks on the d file, and now pawn to h6, creating some breathing room for the king here on h7, rook 8 to d1, and now just rook f to c8. And Prag can be very happy about his position. He's going to play bishop to b7, counter Magnus' strong bishop on g2, and he never really has to worry about something like rook to d7, as long as the knight is on f6, the d7 square is covered. So here rook to d6, Magnus says, all right, I'm gonna go after your c5 pawn. You've pushed it, you've created a weakness, now the knight is attacking it. I'm gonna play queen to e3, put more pressure on it. How are you defending this pawn? And okay, Prag has to make a choice, and he plays bishop to b7, a very cool idea was also rook to b1, saying that, okay, this just isn't really all that impressive. Now there's a threat of queen captures on d6, and basically Magnus would have to decide whether he wants to play rook captures, queen captures, or he wants to play something like rook back to d2 or something. Basically saying that rook to d6 isn't all that impressive. But Pragg goes for bishop b7 first. He wants to capture, get the king exposed here on the light square diagonal, and then always have this queen b7 check as an option. So queen to e3, Magnus continues with his plan, goes after the c5 pawn, and now bishop captures, king captures, and queen to c7 now, putting another defensive piece to defend c5, and here Magnus plays something that should not be possible. He plays knight captures on c5, and this is pretty weird as the c5 square is defended twice by Pragg's queen and by Pragg's rook. Point is here that if queen captures on c5, Magnus has this wonderful rook to d8 check. Now if rook captures, Magnus picks up the queen, so there's that, and if king moves to h7, then you just win the queen, or rather pick up the queen, rook captures, and then you pick up the rook on b8, and now you're just up the exchange in a completely winning endgame. So this is Carlsen's idea. However, Pragg says not so quick, knight back to e8, as we all know that the strongest move is always with the knight back. Now saying you do not have this trick of rook to d8, as now it doesn't come with check, plus your rook is hanging, and also your knight is hanging. So how are you defending this? And Magnus has to admit that he might have jumped to conclusion a bit too soon, and he has to continue happily sacrificing pieces. So knight captures on e6, and now while Pragg could go for queen captures on c4, this would put more pressure on the knight here, and the knight would still be hanging. He first plays queen to b7 with check, and now how can Magnus defend here? The problem is if you play something like f3, we just play knight captures on d6, and that's it. There's no good way of defending this. For example, rook captures on d6, just rook to e8, and that's it. The knight will fall, and Pragg will just be up a full rook. Of course, completely winning position for him. So Magnus plays the only move that doesn't lose, and that is rook 6 back to d5. He blocks check this way, and now Pragg plays f captures on e6, now threatening to pick up the rook. So queen captures on e6, the only move for Magnus, king to h8, and now queen to e4, putting the queen in between the rook and the king, and now the rook can move, for example, to e5. You offer a queen trade, and now Pragg could consider a move like knight to d6. This kicks away the queen, as if the rook takes the knight, then the queen hangs on e4. But first we have queen to c6, going after the c4 pawn, and now rook 1 to d4. Magnus just defends it. Now we have queen back to a8, keeping an eye on the back rank, and also probably just waiting for Magnus to move the rook to trade queens, which is exactly what happens. Rook to e5, and now Pragg trades. Queen captures, rook captures, and rook to c7 now. Keeping an eye on the 7th rank, not allowing any lifting of the rooks, because if those rooks get lifted on the 7th rank, then it could be pretty bad for Pragg. And yes, he is up a piece, but Magnus is up 3 pawns. So if once he starts pushing those pawns, and you can be pretty sure that he will do that, Pragg will have to defend very well. So here we have rook to e5, now comes knight to f6. We have pawn to f3. Magnus has to find a perfect structure on how to push those pawns. We have rook b to c8, putting pressure on the c4 pawn, and rook to a5. Now Magnus says, all right, you capture here, I'm gonna capture on a7, but now knight to d7. Now Pragg is going to b6, and he will just add another attacker to the pawn. So king f2, knight to c5, sorry, that's not knight to c5. Knight to b6 is a move you could play, and it's very interesting that Pragg decided against it. Then probably Magnus just plays c5, and the game continues, kind of trying to force rook captures here, and then rook captures here. But then you could also play knight back to d7, now threatening knight captures here. Then c6 comes knight to b8. We attack it once again, and here probably Pragg just wins the c6 pawn at some point. But okay, Pragg instead went for knight to c5. He has a different plan. We have rook to d5, and now comes pawn to a6. This is the setup that he wanted, and knight is an excellent blockading piece. The a6 pawn is now defended, and now he can do whatever he pleases. So g4 by Magnus, rook to c6, and now pawn to h4. We have king to g8. Pragg starts bringing the king into the game, and rook f5. Magnus denies it. We have rook 8 to c7, and now comes pawn to h5, grabbing the g6 square for himself, which can be pretty useful now. The king is very much boxed in. If Pragg is not careful and the rook somehow ends up here, could even be checkmate. So here, knight to b7. Now Pragg can kick the rook away. Rook 8 to d5, and now finally rook captures on c4. We have rook f to e5, and now rook 4 to c5. Going for a rook trade here, as you can't allow Magnus to start using those rooks. Rook captures on c5, knight captures, and now we have pawn to f4. So now Pragg wants some material here. He still has his knight, but Magnus now only has 5 pawns to Pragg's 3 pawns. So king f7, we have king to f3, and now knight to b7. You could also go for knight to d7, knight to f6 to try and help the king keep those pawns at bay, but Pragg has again a different idea. Knight to b7, rook to d5, and now king to e6. We have rook to e5 check. Magnus will now try everything in order for Pragg to lose more time and hopefully not find some sort of a winning idea. King to d6, and now pawn to e3, stopping any checks. We have knight to c5, and now pawn to g5. Magnus continues pushing those pawns. He wants to create a pass pawn. Knight to e6 by Pragg, and now g captures on h6. We have g captures, and here Magnus plays rook to f5, which is seems like a good idea. He wants to play rook to f6 and go after the pawn, but Pragg plays king to e7. This stops the rook from going to the f6 square, and now Magnus is basically without a good move. And worst of all, he plays a completely losing idea. Magnus plays king to g4, and now the position is completely winning for Pragg, but I'm not going to tell you what should be played. Feel free to pause the video here and try to find the winning idea for Praggnanandhaa while I give you a couple of seconds. So for those of you who were able to do it, congratulations on realizing that if the rooks get traded off, the position is winning for Pragg. And for those of you who just want to enjoy the show, it is rook to c5. This is the only winning move, and it doesn't matter how white trades the rooks, as they will get traded off. It's still just winning. To give you an example, if rook captures, knight captures, now it seems like, okay, you can start pushing those pawns. Let's say king f5, you even win a nice square for your king. Doesn't matter. King f7, let's say e4, knight to d3, you're going to push e5, knight to c5, and once white plays something, as you can't push this, the knight covers that. Let's say king g4. Now comes king e6, and you can't go here, you can't go here, you can't push f5 because king captures here, and now the knight will just use a few fancy moves, pick up the a3 pawn, and then you push this pawn to victory. The white king is too far away to stop this. So that's how you win. However, Pragg did not find this, as in the heat of battle he was very low on time. He was below 30 seconds. He played rook to c3, which also looks nice. You attack this pawn, you attack this pawn, but now you allow Magnus rook to e5, defending this pawn and also threatening f5 to win the knight here. So king f6, rook f5 check, king g7, now rook back to e5. Magnus is being very annoying here. King to f7, rook f5 check, king to e7, and rook to e5, again with the threat of f5. So rook to c5, now going for this move that would have won the game a few moves ago, but now the rook is not on f5. It's the exact same position, only with the rook being on e5 instead of on f5, and now Magnus says rook to e4, which of course he plays. So king f6, rook to a4, now going after the a6 pawn, and a5 by Pragg. Pawn to e4, and now comes knight to c7. Here we have rook to d4, and now knight to e6. And Magnus plays the spectacular rook to d7, and Pragg doesn't want to blunder another game like he did yesterday against the Duda when he blundered that mate in one. Here you can see that Carlsen is controlling all of these squares, even the g6 square with the pawn, the rook controlling all of these squares, and now e5 will be deadly if this lands, and Pragg is now without a move. He has to give up the knight. So he plays knight captures on f4, king captures, and rook captures on h5, and all of a sudden it is equal material. Incredible as that sounds. So rook d6 check, king to e7 goes after the rook, rook to a6, and now rook to h4. We have king e5, rook to h5 check, king to d4, and now rook to b5. And now the problem, rook to b5. And now the problem is for Pragg that Magnus is up on time and it's equal position. So now it's Magnus who will try to push and hope that Pragg misses something. So e5 and now h5. Pragg starts pushing the h pawn, rook to h6 going after this pawn, and now just rook to b3 going after the a3 pawn. We have a4 and now pawn to h4, hoping for rook captures on h4. Then rook b4 check picks up the rook, but of course Magnus will not mess this up. King to d5, we have rook to d3 with check, king to e4, now rook to a3. Again, if rook captures, just rook captures here. So king f5, rook to f3 check, king e4, rook to a3, king to f5, rook to f3 check, king e4, and rook to a3. And he was in this position on move 76 that Magnus Carlsen and Praggnanandhaa agreed to a draw in in game one of round 7 of the FTX Crypto Cup. So truly an amazing start to the match. Pragg, it was always only the question is the question was, will Pragg win this or not, as he equalized pretty early and he was the one pushing for the entire game, and he had that beautiful position where Magnus allowed this after king to g4, this rook to c5, but with a few seconds on the clock he just didn't spot that. Well, either he probably spotted that he can trade off the rooks, but maybe not immediately that the position was winning, as that can be very tricky. Like we always say, when there's a knight in the position, it's impossible to calculate. So yeah, that's the game. Hope you guys enjoyed it and that you have used those timestamps well. I would like to thank Attila Kaza, Brian Enriquez, Dirai Krishna Kumar, Lucian Grozov, and Akshay Pandit for a contribution to my channel. Thank you a lot. I really appreciate it. As usual, you can check 2 of my previous videos here. Thank you for watching, and I will see you soon, continuing the coverage of the match Magnus Carlsen versus Praggnanandhaa, as that is the match that will decide the fate of the FTX Crypto Cup. Thank you all. I will see you soon, and have an excellent rest of your day.